All right. Well, good afternoon, everyone. It is great to be here. It's great to be here to tell you about the book, The Surprising Science of Meetings. So let's just jump right in. All right. There are approximately 55 million meetings a day in the US alone. When you have 55 million of something at work, a reasonable question to ask is, well, what's the return on this massive investment we're making? So I've been doing research on that and working with a lot of different organizations. And what we find is that around 50% of meeting time is a good use of time. 50% of the meeting time, folks say, yeah, I'm glad I'm there. But that also means 50% of the time people are saying, oh man, I'd rather be doing something else. This isn't all that relevant to me. The return on this meeting investment is really quite suspect. But the good news is that meeting science exists, and meeting science can truly move the dial on meetings. All right, here's what we're going to do in our time together. There's a few pieces. So first, I'm going to tell you about some of this crazy meeting science. Then I want to share with you some implications for you as leaders, as well as some implications for organizations more broadly. I wear a ton of different hats at the university. One of my hats is the hat of a meeting team scientist. And yes, that's actually a thing. And for the last, crazy that this is going to come out of my mouth, the last 20 years, I've been doing research on meetings. So I have been doing all kinds of studies on this topic, and I reached the point that I said, you know what? I think it's time to try to synthesize all this evidence and to produce this book. And I wrote this book, The Surprising Science of Meetings, really thinking that no one would read it, because who wants to read a book about meetings? But I was so surprised and delighted that when the book came out January 1st, on January 2nd, Washington Post named it the #1 leadership book. Blown away. It made no sense to me. I broke all the rules. A, my title was more than just one word. B, my title had the word science in it, which I guess is a no-no. This accolade was so exciting, not because it meant that I sold more books, because that obviously is a good thing, but as a meeting scientist, it just felt validating. And it really spoke to the fact that people were willing to consider science to address one of the most vexing problems at work. Let's collect some very, very quick data. You have 3 answer choices. The question is, what percentage of people complain about wasted time in meetings? All right, so I want you to clap if your answer is A, 0 to 33%. All right. B. All right. Okay, don't be ashamed. All right, C. All right. Thank you for that quick round of applause. I really appreciate it. That extra energy keeps me moving. Yeah, so everyone, basically, the majority said C. No matter where I am presenting this on this topic of meetings, no matter what country, C always emerges as the most common choice. Wasted time in meetings is just a common concern. There's a chorus, no matter where you are. Even senior managers indicate that 72% of meetings are not productive. So you have all this incredible frustration. And at the same time, going back to 55 million. So you have 55 million meetings, all this incredible frustration. Well, you could make the case that we are both living and dying in meetings. But as an organizational psychologist, I saw this as an amazing opportunity. An perfect opportunity, right? Because if we can fix what's most frustrating to people, this is extremely exciting, especially because the elimination of meetings is a false goal. We need meetings. Meetings are essential for communication, cooperation, consensus decision-making. What we want to do is eliminate bad meetings, not just eliminate meetings. My question to you, can research provide some insights? What do you think? Yes, otherwise there'd be a pamphlet up here. There wouldn't be a book. I'd be doing a pamphlet tour. Yes, research can definitely provide some insights. So let me share with you some of these insights. There's research that compares standing up meetings to sitting down meetings. Which one do you think produces better results, standing up or sitting down? All right, it's kind of a trick question. What we find is that standing up meetings and sitting down meetings actually produce similar decision quality, but the standing up meetings take nearly half as much time. Then there's research on meeting satisfaction. There is someone who tends to leave almost all of their meetings saying, that was really good. I'm really glad I was there. Want to take a guess who that person is? Organizer? Yeah, the meeting leader. Right? Why not though, right? They're in control. And then the person who's second most satisfied? Who do you think that is? The person who talks the most. They also feel like it's really good. So like, I feel like this Google Talk's going really well. All right, then there's research on silence. All right, so we have two types of groups. One group is talking, the other group is in silence. And their task is the same. The task is to brainstorm, right? Brainstorm some potential solutions. And research has shown that those groups brainstorming in silence are much more effective than those groups brainstorming with their voices. That when you brainstorm in silence, you generate nearly twice as many ideas, and the ideas that are generated are more innovative and even more disruptive. And why is that? Why are the silent brainstorming groups more effective? What do you think? Okay, so they have more time to think. They're not hearing everyone's voice in their head. Excellent. What else? Please. That's right. That's right. Everyone has access to the floor at once, and people are not editing their answers, right, based on what the boss is saying. So it's a true democracy where people can bring their full selves to the brainstorming. And as a result, it's much more effective. Simple solution, right? I mean, silence is easy to incorporate in meetings. All right, let me share a few other studies for context. This is one of my first studies, and we had people keep diaries. And in these diaries, they recorded how many meetings they had that day, and they indicated how they felt about their day. So they kept it for 5 days. And what we found was that in those days where you had lots and lots of meetings, people felt fatigued. They felt drained. But most concerning is they felt that they had more work yet to do. They didn't experience a sense of accomplishment. And these effects were most negative for your best performing employees. We find that around half of meetings start late. And what's the major reason why meetings start late? Other meetings. Other meetings. I mean, it's crazy when you stop and think about it. We organize our entire school system so that people have transitions to get to their next classes. But when it comes to organizations, all that good logic of transitions goes out the door. We don't build in transitions. And yet people often work in places that are very spread out. All right, we conducted an experiment on meeting lateness. And what we found is that when meetings started late, it actually had meaningful consequences. When meetings started late, the meetings did not produce as good of outcomes as those meetings that started on time. And the reason being, because we videotaped groups when they did start late. When groups started late, there was more frustration. People actually were meaner to one another. They weren't listening as intently. So there's this frustration that hurt kind of these constructive communication processes. One thing just as bad as starting late, beer, running over. So I Google, I can say that here. That's like a really good thing. Yeah, it was natural. So I Googled pictures of running over. They're not pretty. So I found that one. I felt like that worked pretty well. So yeah, when meetings run over, they're incredibly frustrating for people. Again, that shouldn't surprise us. You're breaking the contract, which is what that time period is. All right, final piece of science. And I think this is perhaps the most important work. In this study, we asked people about the meeting practices of their supervisor. Right? So we try to identify how their boss leads meetings. And then we asked them about their engagement overall with the job. Not with the meeting, but overall with their job. So we want to see if how their boss runs meetings affects their engagement overall with the job. And engagement, as you all know, is extremely important. Engagement predicts performance, helping behavior, cooperation, all kinds of positive outcomes. And what we found was really important, that those leaders who were more judicious in the calling of meetings, right? They only called meetings when they truly had something important and relevant to those attendees. When those leaders who carefully managed time, starting on time and ending on time, and those leaders who created psychological safety in meetings, where there was true freedom of speech, when those leaders created those conditions, what we found was that employees reported more engagement overall with the jobs themselves. So while we often think about meetings as being places of drain, meetings can be places of gain when they're done well. The overall takeaway, in 2 words from this meeting science, is that meetings matter. Meetings truly matter. Too many organizations are just assuming that bad meetings are a way of life. And it doesn't have to be that way. But bad meetings have a tremendous cost. And it's a dollar cost. Right? We can cost every meeting based on the people's salaries. So bad meetings hurt innovation. Bad meetings waste time, ROI. And bad meetings even result in something called meeting recovery syndrome, MRS. Meeting recovery syndrome. And this is the idea that when we have a bad meeting, we just don't leave it at the door. It sticks with us. We ruminate. And we typically co-ruminate. We need to talk to someone else about it to make sense of how bad it was. But meetings done right are an incredible opportunity. And it truly is an opportunity for organizational leaders. So, who's responsible for making meetings better? Everyone, right? We all are. We all have a responsibility because we can find meetings that we lead. Now, I see you giggling. I don't know if it's giggling because you see a dog up there. All right. You ready for this? This is true surprising science of meetings. Wild African dogs actually have meetings. What? Wild African dogs actually have meetings. This research has been going on where they have video cameras watching these wild African dogs for 5 years. And what they find is that these dogs would come together before they moved to another hunting ground. And there was a voting process that took place using sneezes. And that when the majority of the dogs sneezed, then they moved to another hunting place. Crazy. And there's other species that have meetings as well. So yes, dogs don't get a pass. Dogs have to do better on their meetings too. Why not? All right. So I'm going to give you a quick taste, 6 tips for leaders to make meetings better. Now, when I first started talking about my book, I called this my top 6. And someone said to me, Stephen, you're an idiot. It wasn't family. It was someone else. Says, you're an idiot because if you say it's your top 6, then no one's going to buy your book because they're going to get the top 6. So I no longer do that. Instead, what I do is I randomly selected 6 tips out of the 2 million that are in your book. And I did this last night. I don't even know what tips showed up. So let's see what the 6 randomly selected tips are. So I'm going to learn them at the same time as you are. So let's take a look. All right, number 1, mindset. So our research suggests that those leaders who are particularly good at leading meetings actually have something in common. They recognize that they're inherently a steward of others' time. Think about that. Isn't that what a meeting leader really is? You're asking people to give you one of the most precious resources, time. You've called them together. So the best meeting leaders recognize that you're a steward. And once you have that mindset of being a steward, you start to become intentional, right? You just don't do things because everyone else is doing them, especially because they're doing them wrong. Instead, you become intentional. You start to truly think. You start to think about who needs to be there. You start to think about the relevance of the agenda items. You truly care about facilitating. And if someone's not talking, that bothers you. Because you invited them. You invited them because you wanted to hear their opinions. Now, interestingly, this intentionality is actually something that we all generally do every time we meet with a customer or someone who is our boss. Right? When we meet with a customer, we are definitely intentional. Right? We don't want that customer to leave a meeting with us dissatisfied. So we think about those meetings. But all that great deliberation, we typically just stick it in a file drawer and don't look at it again when it comes to meeting with our peers or our teams. So that's the first important takeaway. Number 2, most meetings tend to be 1 hour. Why do they tend to be 1 hour? Yeah, default calendar setting. Well, that's really not a good reason to have a meeting that's a 1 hour, especially because of something called Parkinson's law. And Parkinson's law is this idea that work expands to fill whatever time is allotted to it. So how long does a 1 hour meeting take? 1 hour. It's magical. So we can use Parkinson's law to our favor, right? So we can look at our agenda, look at the key things that we need to address, and say to ourselves, well, how much time should this take? And if it's going to be 48 minutes, go with it. It's okay. You don't have to have an hour-long meeting. In fact, once you determine amount of time, I challenge you to dial it back a little bit. Psychological research shows that when groups are under a little bit of pressure, they actually perform optimally. Number 3, manage meeting size. As meetings increase in size, so does dysfunction. So we have to actively manage meeting size. There's a number of ways of doing that. So first of all, we could just invite some people for some of the meeting, but not all of the meeting. Right? So the first part of the meeting could be a larger group, but then let people go who are not needed for all the agenda items. Simple solution. Another strategy is when you're deciding on who should be at the meeting, think about it as core attendees and kind of nice to have attendees. The core attendees have to be there. We know who they are. We get in trouble with the nice to have attendees. So the nice to have attendees is really what pushes us over the top. Now, it's not necessarily a bad thing, because one of the things that we find in our research is that, yes, people find meetings really bad, but they also find not being invited to a meeting very troubling. Right? So they still want to be invited. So we have to kind of manage that psychology, and we can do it. If we go to our secondary attendees and tell them, hey, we're having a meeting, and here are the topics on the meeting, and I don't think they're all that relevant, but I want to give you an opportunity to provide input, if you have any. And I'm going to show you the meeting minutes when the meeting's done. And at any future point you want to go to one of these meetings, you're more than welcome. If I say those 3 things, every one of those secondary attendees will say, I'm good. I'm good. And we're giving people their greatest gift, more time. Number 4, start your meetings well. This actually really matters. Our research shows that the mood that the leader brings into the meeting actually contaminates the rest of the meeting. And that contamination could be positive or negative. But we want groups to be in more of a positive mood state, because when groups are in a more positive mood state, they're actually more creative. They're more open-minded. So leaders set that tone. And it's consistent with that steward notion. Right? When you have folks arrive in the meeting, you have to remember that you're a host. So what does a host do? A host welcomes people. A host thanks people for coming. Like, I really appreciate that you all are here today. Right? A host makes introductions. If you don't know this person, I'm saying, hey, let me make that introduction, because that's what a host does. And sometimes a host even has snacks. All right, number 5. Try alternative formats, right? If you think about the fact that there are 55 million meetings a day, and they all kind of have different agendas, what's so striking is they're so similar. Everyone's basically doing the exact same thing. So mix it up. If you've never tried a standing meeting, go ahead, try a standing meeting. If you've never tried a speedy meeting, try speedy meetings. Mix it up. Change where people sit around a table. That actually matters. Research shows that seating position affects communication flow. That's not necessarily a problem, but to build kind of a more dynamic environment, mix it up. If you've never tried a walking meeting, go for a walk. These dyadic walking meetings are terrific. The data on them suggests that they're more creative, people like them, and you get your steps in. Number 6, final one in this randomly selected list. I like them so far. I didn't know what I was going to get, but I think they're okay. I think I'm going to buy that book. No, I'm just kidding. I already have 100. All right, number 6. So earlier I mentioned to you that there's this meeting leader blind spot, right? That meeting leaders think that they're much better at meetings than what it appears the data would actually support. So as a result, the best meeting leaders periodically check in with their regular attendees and say, how am I doing? How can we make our meetings better? Right? Just try to have a conversation about improving this shared, because it's a shared experience. And at the very least, good meeting leaders should scan the environment to see how they're doing. If everyone is on their phones during your meetings, that's feedback that maybe your meetings are not that engaging or you invited too many people. If there are people who are not participating in your meeting, that's feedback. If there are side conversations, that's feedback. All right, so what I want to do now is I want to illustrate some of this meeting science through a challenge that I give you all. All right, so here's your exercise. You're going to get into pairs, and I want you just to take a minute and address this question. How do you deal with the situation that just a couple of folks are dominating the conversation and there's a lack of engagement by others? All right, so turn to your neighbor, just take a minute and see how would you deal with this situation? All right, so this is a very common situation in meetings. Meeting science would suggest trying to design the problem away before it even starts. So let me share with you how meeting science would address that situation. So first of all, meeting science would suggest having agenda owners that aren't just the leader, right? A good leader doesn't have to own every single item. They could share it with others. It's a great way of getting engagement, and then you can give the person some feedback about how they did with that agenda item. A great way to get more conversation in a meeting is actually to prime it before the meeting starts. If I go to my shy individual and say, I really would like to hear from you this meeting, they're going to participate much more readily. That goes right nicely to this next one, establish norms. This so often doesn't happen in meetings, where before a meeting starts, you say, hey, here's what I hope to see in this meeting. I want to see everyone communicating. I want people to keep their contributions succinct, though. I want you to truly listen to what everyone is saying. Establish some norms. Those conversations don't take place. Dyadic work. You just did that. Wasn't that amazing? Just getting people in dyads, and it could be just 1 minute, changes the entire complexion of the meeting. Not only does it get everyone engaged, but even if a shy person had suggested an idea that maybe they wouldn't initially share, their partner will share it for them. Collect ideas before the meeting. Like, use that silence. If I have a topic, I can ask people before the meeting, hey, contribute to this Google Doc, your ideas and thoughts. They do that before being contaminated by everyone else. And then there's all kinds of awesome meeting apps. If you really want to know what the consensus is, do it anonymously. Let people vote on their phones. All right, Amazon. So I want to share this example because sometimes disengagement in meetings is confounded with lack of preparation, right? If people haven't prepared, then they kind of pull back. So Amazon, in one of their meeting practices, they build pre-read time into the meeting itself. So instead of expecting people to read the materials in advance of the meeting, they do it at the actual meeting. And this could be very comforting for the meeting leader because then 10 to 15 minutes in, they know everyone is on the same page with regard to the preparation. All right, continuing that stream, I want to tell you a little bit more about organizational practices to reinforce the behaviors of good for meeting leaders. All right, so here are some meeting practices that are more systemic, that reinforce these leader behaviors that we hope to see. Meaningful training. So in many regards, unbelievably, research suggests that only around 20% of all leaders receive any training on how to run a meeting. That's insane. With 55 million meetings a day and only 20% of leaders receiving training, this is clearly a blind spot for organizations. And the training that exists tends to be ineffective. It tends to be tactics-based. It tells leaders, do this and your meetings will be better. The research doesn't support that. Here's the example. So most meeting training will say, good leaders always have agendas. Do you know the research on agendas is highly equivocal? Having an agenda in of itself doesn't do anything for meeting effectiveness. But if you step back and reflect, that shouldn't surprise you. First of all, nearly 50% of agendas are recycled. Next, what's more important is not having an agenda, but what's on the agenda. Is it meaningful for the people that are there? And what's even more important is how did you facilitate conversation around those items? So those are more dynamic traits. So having an agenda is not going to be the answer in of itself. It has to be packaged with more meaningful change. All right, while I'm talking about agendas, does anyone want an agenda bonus tip? Do you? Okay, one person. We're going to get a small group. All right, I got enough people. Agenda bonus tip. So most agendas are organized by topics. What I want to challenge you to try is organizing your agenda as a set of questions to be answered. We're coming together to answer this set of questions. That's a very different cognitive exercise. Thinking about it in forms of questions really requires you to think much more carefully about why people are being called together. By thinking of them as questions, you have a better sense of who needs to be invited, right? They're relevant to answering the questions. You know when to end the meeting because the questions have been answered. And you know if the meeting's been successful because the answers are compelling. And if you can't think of any questions, maybe you don't need a meeting. All right, so I want to share a few more cultural practices before we wrap up. Some organizations have implemented an approval process for larger meetings. So you all know very well that we can hijack our colleagues' calendars. So this organization says, okay, if a meeting is going to be more than 8 people, you actually have to get approval from your boss. Now that sounds pretty draconian, but think about it. It requires the meeting leader to actually start to make decisions more carefully and to think, not just get people in that meeting. One of the things I've been really excited about is these little book clubs that have formed around my book. This is really neat. People, as you saw in our little discussion, people have strong opinions about meetings. People they don't want to go to meetings, but they want to talk about meetings. So getting groups together, reading some content, and saying, how can we do our meetings better, is a fantastic exercise to elevate this topic. Meeting free times. We used to think that only creative people benefited from uninterrupted time. That is false. All humans benefit from some time that's uninterrupted. So organizations that allow for some time where people can be free of interruptions is a good idea. Some organizations have been silent about meetings, and they're starting to create a meeting guidance document. And these could be 1 or 2 pages where it outlines, hey, here's our principle. Here's what we are going to do as an organization around meetings. We're going to start on time. We're going to start defaulting to 50 minutes as opposed to an hour, etc. A CMO. No one in organizations is owning meetings. Yet, it represents nearly 15% of your personnel budget. So what some organizations are doing, they're saying, okay, this person's now going to own meetings systemically. Whether it's the chief talent officer, whether it's the chief technology officer, whether it's the CEO, we need to make sure someone takes the responsibility of being the chief meeting officer. And finally, I've done a number of presentations to various talent and HR groups, and I always ask this question: how many organizations in this room have content on their engagement surveys around meetings? So hypothetically, let's say I asked 100 organizations. How many people raised their hands? What? 25? No. Only around 2 to 3 people. This is an incredible blind spot. In fact, this blind spot theme is pervasive around this whole talk. Meeting leaders have a blind spot. Organizations don't train people, another blind spot. Organizations don't assess this on their engagement survey, another blind spot. So why are meetings complained about? Because we're not doing anything about them. All right, finish line on our journey around meetings. So I get asked a lot, how am I feeling about meetings? I'm excited about meetings. I'm excited about meetings. I'm excited that there is a science of meetings that can truly help. I'm excited that if you make 20% of your meetings 20% better, it has a tremendous effect on an organization. And while you can't control other people's meetings, you can control your meetings. You can do things differently. You can lead your meetings in an evidence-based way and hopefully be the model for others to copy. So with that, it's a good time to stop. I look forward to hearing your questions. I have my website up there, and you could come check it out. I have more meeting resources. But thank you so much for hearing about meeting science.
We have a normal, I think, a calendar default to start meetings at the top of the hour, 30 minutes past. And they're supposed to end before the end of that period.
Right.
Of course, they never do. They tend to run over. Would it actually be better to set a meeting default in an organizational calendar to have meetings start 5 or 10 minutes past the hour and then end on time? Because they will.
Yeah, exactly. I love that approach.
Yeah.
I absolutely love that idea. So there are organizations that have been playing with starting meetings at odd starting times, right? Because a meeting doesn't have to start at an even time. Right. So they start like staff meetings at 10:18. People find it really curious, right? Like, oh, wow, what's going on here? I'm really glad I'm going to be there because that sounds like a meeting I want to be at. So, I mean, it goes back to the comment I made earlier that with 55 million meetings and they're all basically looking and feeling the same, right? We can change that up. It's awesome. Good idea.
Great talk. Thank you.
Oh, you're welcome.
I have 2 questions. So it sounded like the first section, you described a lot of things managers could do,
right,
or meeting leaders could do to make meetings better. Are there things that we as non-managers can do to make meetings better, and what would that look like? And then the second question was...
Well, let me answer the first one, because my memory is so short-term, like I'll forget. So let me answer that first one. So that's a great question, and I get asked that a lot, and I don't have a good answer. Meeting participants relinquish power when they walk in that room. They have very little control. They've given it to the meeting leader, which is why I'm so passionate around this topic, because I want meeting leaders to recognize what they're being asked to do and how much power they have. So what can participants do? So participants obviously can lead their meetings. You can find some meeting that you lead and do it well, although that can backfire. Actually, we had a family meeting, and my daughter turned to me and said, "Dad, you're not being a good steward of others' time." I'm not even kidding you. And that broke my heart. So you can find meetings that you can do better. But you can also do some shadow facilitation. So what that looks like is you could say, hey, Shahar, I haven't heard from you. I'd love to hear your thoughts too, right? So you can kind of help bring other people into the conversation. And that could be really useful.
Makes sense.
Good.
And I think one of the first points you raised was intentionality.
Yes.
Can you say a little bit more about that? What is a good intention for a meeting look like?
So what I want is a meeting leader to say, okay, I'm having a meeting. I need to give this at least a few minutes of thought. I need to think about how I'm going to run this meeting. What story am I telling, right? How should I order my agenda items? What alternative strategies should I do to get people more involved and engaged? How maybe can I leverage silence? I just want a meeting leader to take 3 minutes and think. It doesn't take much time. I just want them to not get into all these meeting habits, never questioning them. So just take a few minutes and reflect.
So my question is around these kind of larger team meetings that are often structured as like update meetings, right? So at a place like Google, where teams are very large and sometimes spread out, we have these regular update meetings that are often meant to not just update on work other teams are doing, but also to kind of create a sense of community where people are spread out and don't get to speak often. How, or do you have any tips or a point of view on making those effective and engaging? Because what happens is work is often sent out via email, but people don't read it, or they're just busy because they're in meetings all day. And there's this weird balance of making sure these meetings are purposeful and engaging, but also just necessary to keep kind of team cohesiveness.
Those are tricky. What I would say that there are a number of ways of doing them that perhaps could be helpful. So first of all, when people are doing updates, the updates can be done in 30 seconds. Don't give people unlimited time because they take it, right? Their own personal Parkinson's law. So we can make it a fun game. We can say you have 30 seconds to give an update. Well, that could actually make it funny to see, and you could put a timer up, right? So that's a way of kind of doing it. Another practice, and this is something very common at Twitter, where they will do their update meeting in silence for the first part. So what they would do is they have a Google Doc, and they would show all the various individuals, and they take the first part of the meeting, everyone would type in their update in real time. So everyone is seeing the update emerge, and people start commenting on it as other people's updates. They start making integrations. It's really dynamic and fun. So we often think of silence as not being interactive and engaging and dynamic, but I can promise you, once you start playing with silence, you won't want to stop. So that's a second technique, and that could really work really well. I won't say any more because you have to read the book. I have more. Those were 2 randomly selected solutions. All right, what else?
This is a pure curious question, but given your 20 years of research and wild African dogs aside, what is your own most interesting finding that you're most surprised by in your research?
So I often get asked what makes this research surprising, and my typical response is that science even exists on this topic. That's what's kind of surprising. My own personal, okay. So I think my own personal is the agenda one, right? Because I really went into this research, like if you pick up any meeting book, they'll typically say, okay, step 1, have an agenda. So I really did think that having an agenda was going to be the panacea to many of the problems. And the research just wasn't supporting it. And then the story just kept getting more interesting. Once I started discovering this idea of recycled agendas and how common it is, and then some of these other things, right, having an agenda without intentionality. So I think the agenda story was probably my own personal one. And I think what's also fascinating is that you can imagine how an insecure leader who has not been trained, or maybe if they have, they say, okay, I want to do this meetings well, I'll just have an agenda, now I'm good. And that whole idea that, what a counterproductive practice that could turn out to be. Thanks for the question.
Hey.
Hi.
So given what you were just saying about the agenda issue, what are your thoughts, rather, I shouldn't even load the question, but what are your thoughts around spending the first 1 or 2 minutes getting buy-in from the group on the agenda and adding additional items or taking items off? Is that opening the floodgates, or is that good?
I don't like it because I think you should do it before the meeting. So people say, should you get the agenda out in advance? And the answer is yes, because I want people to be able to opt out, right? So I want the agenda to start to come to shape before the meeting starts. Now, that doesn't mean on the fly you can add something. Like I can see, like I don't want to be inflexible, right? Because a good steward is not inflexible. So I think that that particular exercise invites kind of this lack of intentionality because now you haven't really thought about it or planned it. And so the cadence that I would recommend is you come up with the set of topics that you think are really important. Then you open up to your team all before the meeting. What are some of the things that are on your mind that you think we should definitely cover? And then you kind of bring that together. That's your job. And if things are equal, go with the employee provided issue, right? Because that's really important. It's a great way of building engagement and inclusion. So I like you being in that role, being purposeful and thoughtful before the meeting starts. Great question.
Comparing reoccurring meetings to one-off meetings, how would you, how much of your research was reoccurring weekly meetings versus we have to have a meeting now?
Cool question. Thank you. So my research has covered all those types. And I know we haven't really talked about virtual meetings, but I cover that in the book too. And basically, the regular versus the one-off, the keys to success are identical. The one-off, though, there's a few things that I think are particularly helpful. First of all, with the one-off, you want to make sure you establish norms, right? Because typically that doesn't happen. So making sure that everyone's kind of on the same page about what we're hoping to, how we want to run this meeting. Then the flip side of that is the regular occurring meeting are more ripe for evaluation. Any regular occurring meeting should be examined every 3 months. And now I'm not talking about some crazy survey. I'm just asking about what's going well, what's going not so well, what can we do differently? Like I'm asking for something that takes 2 minutes, but I want that level of engagement around the topic.
My follow-up to that is, was there any analysis of the long-term productivity of regular meetings that maybe aren't in that 30-minute slot, are not considered successful, but the accumulation of those meetings over a period of time create something greater than, was there any analysis of that? Does that make sense, what I'm asking?
I don't think I'm fully following. So it's this idea that just each individual meeting might not be that good, but as a collective?
Yes, like the snowball effect of everyone getting together. Right. Maybe not necessarily walking out from that meeting feeling like it was perfect or totally worth their time, but something happened in that meeting that will then influence the rest of the day, the rest of the product.
Sure. So if a meeting is 30 minutes and a person leaves saying, I got two good nuggets out of that, I do not think that was a successful meeting. I'm glad they got those 2 nuggets, but I still feel like the ratio of good time to wasted time is too high. I think you can have your cake and eat it too. I think that's the bottom line for me. Like, we can use this science and get 80% of meeting time effective, not 100%, because everyone's different and in a different place. So I think we can raise the bar. I think so many organizations have lowered the bar so much. I got 2 good pieces out of it. That's just not enough. We're too busy to be satisfied with just 2 pieces.
Do you have any thoughts or suggestions on the best time to hold a meeting, being both within the week and within the day?
So I don't have strong data on that topic. I have anecdotal data. I actually have a doctoral student who's working on a project that will help speak to that. So what we seem to find in our interviews is that meetings on Friday afternoons are not welcome. Meetings first thing in the mornings tend to be pushed against, right? Because people want to ramp up. They want to be able to start their day with some control. So when I'm coaching the leaders, I generally say keep meetings away from early in the mornings, give people their time, keep them from late in the afternoons. I am a big fan of meetings touching lunch, partly because it results in less task switching. So one of the things that if people are constantly asked to switch tasks throughout a day, it can kind of be experienced like we do interruptions, and it takes people out of their flow. But lunch is a natural break. So if I have a meeting before that or after that, then I'm not asking people to task switch. So those to me are the perfect prime times.
Have you looked at the spiritual dimension of meetings? For example, when I observe the church meetings and the community of faith meetings, they always begin with a prayer.
Yeah.
I think that's very good because it brings a peace and harmony to a room. But obviously, in a company setting, we cannot openly pray before the meeting. How about doing a silent prayer? I think that's going to be useful. I wonder whether you have done any research into that.
So I'm going to get at your question from some different directions. So, and it goes back to kind of what we just talked about, where meetings are often experienced like interruptions. And as a result, people often enter into meetings in kind of a not great mental state, right? They were doing another task and now they're being asked to do something else. And so this idea of trying to create separation, right? Separation from what you currently are doing with what you're doing now. And so what, as a leader, can you do to help bridge that separation so that people are glad that they are there? You know, depending on the organization and their values and their goals, I think they have lots of different options. So have I heard of groups doing kind of a silent meditation before they start? I have. And in some cultures that could work. I wouldn't say it's for everyone, but for some it can work, depending on your relationship with your team. But there's other things you can do, right? There's other things that we can do to create separation. So here's another example. You can have music on. People could walk into the conference room and there could be blasting music. And then when the meeting starts, you turn the music off. That's really interesting. When people walk in and they hear like a good song, I mean, that actually changes your affect. So music can be leveraged. The same thing with putting people name placards. So as I mentioned earlier, people sit in the same seats. Well, take each of your attendees, put them on a name placard, and randomly move it around. So people have to find their name placard. That can create presence. Having a snack can create presence. So I think the conclusion to me is that there's a lot of different ways to help bridge that separation, and what you described could be one that could work quite well for some organizations. Thank you.
Thank you so much for being here. If we can give him one more round of applause.
Thank you.